This week we will start talking about Chapter 2A, Budget Basics, and I encourage you to either print the chapter or pull the chapter up and follow along as we go through this week, because you're going to be looking at a lot of calculations. There's a lot of tables in this chapter, and so that you can reference those and make your own notes as we go through it. And then you'll also need to be able to reference this as you do the assignment for this week. So if you want to pause the presentation right now and go print a copy of the chapter, that probably would be a good idea. So for any business to be viable, it has to turn over a profit. And we're going to look at the components of profit. Profit is equal to sales revenue minus variable cost minus fixed cost. Sales revenue is the number of units that you have for sale minus any that were unsellable times the price. So for instance, if you started out with 100 mum pots and 3 of them got broken, then you would multiply 97 by the price to get your sales revenue, the number that you sold times the price, to find out how much money you brought in. Then you subtract the variable cost. Variable costs are direct cost. Those are the costs associated with that crop. You only have that cost because you had that specific crop. So if we were talking about your 100 mums, the cost of 100 pots would be a variable cost. Fixed costs are indirect or overhead cost. Those are the costs that you're going to have regardless of if you raise mums or not. So long as you're in business, you're going to have costs such as insurance, taxes, interest on loans. All of those are considered fixed costs. So you can see here a listing of variable costs and a fixed cost. This list, or this table, is included on page 2 of your book. It's table 1. And just to reiterate what I said before, variable costs are those direct costs that you have only because you decided to raise a certain crop. The fixed costs are things that you're going to have regardless of what you grow. You just have it because you are in fact in business. When we calculate variable cost, we have to calculate that cost per unit or per pot. The example in your book on page 3 in table 2 is for poinsettias. Let's look at the variable cost for a 4-inch pot. The cost of each poinsettia cutting, was 51 cents. The cost of each pot was a little over 5 cents. The cost of the root medium, or the dirt, if you will, that we're going to grow in, was a little over 4 cents. The cost of the fungicide for each poinsettia was under a penny. The cost of insecticide for each pot was 4 cents. And the cost of growth regulators for each crop, or for each poinsettia, was less than a penny. If we were to add each of these together, we would find out that the total variable cost for each of the poinsettias that we raise in a 4-inch pot is 64 7/10 of a cent. Pretty much 65 cents would be our variable cost for 4-inch poinsettias. You can also see how that variable cost would increase as you increase the size of the pot. Then we look at fixed cost. Again, those are the costs that you have just because you're in business. I know the text on this slide is a little bit small, but if you're following along in your book on page 4, these costs can be found in table 3. These are the things that you're going to have no matter what you grow. You have them because you are a greenhouse business. And so that will give you your total fixed costs. One special type of fixed cost that we need to point out here is depreciation. And depreciation is applied to things that lose value. Machinery or your greenhouse structures, those things can be depreciated. To calculate the annual depreciation, we take the purchase price, which is a known value. You know how much you paid for something. We subtract out the salvage value, or the estimated value at the end of that item's life. And then we divide that by the useful life, or the total number of years that we expect that piece of machinery or that building to be in use. That gives us the annual depreciation, which is a fixed cost. Anytime that we are looking at calculating cost for a greenhouse, we have to have a way to divide those fixed costs across each individual plant. With variable cost, it's kind of easy because it's a direct cost related to that plant. With fixed cost, it's a little more difficult. So what we do is we calculate the cost per square foot of greenhouse space per week. So if you see here, if this green box were to be a 10 by 80 greenhouse or 100 by 80 greenhouse, we're looking at how much of the fixed cost can I attribute to that little yellow box in the bottom right hand corner per week, or how much does that yellow box cost me per week to operate. To do this, we take the total fixed cost, divide it by the production space, and then divide it by the number of weeks per year. So if your fixed costs were $280,424 and you had 51,000 square feet of production space, you would get a cost per square foot per year of $5 and roughly 50 cents. Then if we have 52 weeks in the year and we divide that, we would find out that the cost per square foot per week is around 10.5 to 11 cents. However, it's not common that we use all of the greenhouse space all of the year. Sometimes in the greenhouse we have empty space. So if we calculate our cost, as you see on the screen here, we really get an underestimate of what the fixed cost is per square foot. So to get a more accurate representation of the square foot cost per week, we divide each month separately. So here, and this table is found in your book on page 5, it's table 5, you can see that the total production area was 51,000 square feet. Then you can see each month of the year what percentage was used, what percentage of the greenhouse was used as far as how much of that had plants in it, how much was occupied. You can also see the number of weeks that were in that month. And if we were to multiply across, we would find how many square feet weeks each month is responsible for. So for example, if we look at April, the total possible square feet was 51,000. 100% of that space was used for 4 weeks, so that gave us a total number of square feet weeks of 204,000. However, if you contrast that to, say, August, we only use 30% of the greenhouse space, and if we multiply that by 4, then we find out that we only use 61,200 square feet weeks in August. When we total those square feet weeks, we find out that we have 1,522,350 square feet weeks. So if we were to take our total overhead cost or our total fixed cost of $280,424 and divide it by the square feet weeks, we would get a cost per square feet week of 18 cents. This is definitely a larger value than the 10.5 cents we saw before, but it's probably more accurate. So how do we take that 18 cents and divide it out or apply it out over each individual plant so that we can find out our profitability? Let's go back to our poinsettia plants that we mentioned before in 4-inch pots. Let's say that for 4 weeks, your poinsettia plants were spaced out at 0.11 square feet per pot, or 0.11 square feet between pots. Then that would use a total of 0.44 square feet weeks. Then for the next 11 weeks to finish off the production, they were spaced out to 0.56. If we multiply the 11 times the 0.56, then we get 6.16 square feet weeks. When we add that together, we find out that each poinsettia pot was responsible for 6.6 square feet weeks. If we know the cost per square foot week is 18 cents, then we can easily multiply that 18 cents by the square feet weeks that one poinsettia occupied to find out that one poinsettia in a 4-inch pot should be given $1.21.5 of the total fixed cost. We are not going to use the inventory approach for class, but I need you to know that it's available and it's a very accurate way of calculating cost. This is found on page 7 of your book. The inventory approach multiplies the number of each type of plant produced times the space each plant uses over time to calculate the amount of space foot weeks per plant, the amount of square foot weeks per plant. This allows us to assign different cost per season. So if you see here, if you had a crop that was, or if you had expenses of, say, 45% in the spring and 55% in the fall, then you would get different square feet week cost, which would say in the spring your square foot week cost would be 13.5 cents, but in the fall and winter time that cost is almost 26 cents. So if you want to get very specific in how you attribute those fixed cost, you can break down your cost by season. And so when you do that, whenever you calculate your fixed cost, you would look at maybe your electric bill in the spring and then again look at your electric bill in the fall and winter and see what percentage of your total electric bill goes in each of those seasons. Now we also have to consider shrink and unsold plants because despite how well you do, some plants are going to get diseased or some plants just are not going to sell. So in order to do this, we have to take our variable cost, add it to our fixed cost, and then multiply it by an expected shrink multiplier. So if we were going to assume a loss or a shrink of 3% of our crops just didn't grow right, had a disease, whatever. If we took our variable cost from before of 64.7 cents and add that to our fixed cost of $1.70, then we multiply that by our shrink multiplier of 1.031, then we would get a value of $2.42.69, which would mean that we need to charge about $2.43 for a 4-inch poinsettia. These shrink multipliers can be found on page 8 of your book. So now if we go back to the 4-inch poinsettia example, we can look at the profitability or the break-even point where we have the total variable cost and the total fixed cost, and so we must exceed this value to have a profit. If you look on page 9 of your book, you'll see the table that's listed here, and we simply add the variable cost, the fixed cost, and get our total production cost. Multiply that by our 3% shrink to give us a break-even cost. Since we know that at the final spacing or the last 11 weeks we're spaced at 0.56 square feet, if we were to divide our break-even cost by that spacing, then we would find out that we had a square foot revenue of $3. So this week, you're going to complete the Chapter 2A handout as you work through the chapter. And then the Chapter 2A assignment is going to ask you to go to a website and choose a budget. From that budget, you want to calculate the variable cost, the fixed cost, the cost per square foot per week, the square foot per week cost based on the greenhouse production space utilization. So how much of the greenhouse space would you use? Then the allocation of fixed costs for pot sizes based on square feet per week. And then the total cost assuming a shrink of 5%. Let me remind you, if you get to working on this and you have questions, you can always send me an email, give me a call, or stop by the office. With that, have a good week.